Well, Caroline, thank you very, very much indeed. It's a great privilege to be here this evening. Caroline, we miss you in London, but you're achieving so much at this brilliant institution. And it was wonderful to have a cup of tea earlier at the Royal Irish Academy, and to note in that way that people from Stoke-on-Trent do, as I turned over the cup and saucer, that they were made in the potteries by a very great company called Steelite. So Waterford and Wedgwood had their troubles, but there are others available. I want to also thank the Royal Dublin Society and the National Gallery and the National Museum of Ireland for contributing to this evening's lecture and, of course, the conference which opens tomorrow. As we know, this year marks the 170th anniversary of the 1853 Great Industrial Exhibition held here in Dublin, an immensely important milestone in Irish cultural history. It has had far-reaching cultural consequences, not least in the legacy of this great institution and in the foundation of its incredible collection of art, from the likes of Jack B. Yeats, John Lavery, Daniel Maclise and Francis Danby, to, of course, the great collections upstairs, the Titian, the Goya, the Rembrandts, the Caravaggios. This is a collection with a widespread contemporary influence and also a relevance for the Victoria and Albert Museum, because it was on viewing Vermeer's exquisite Woman Writing a Letter with Her Maid, which you can see here for free without standing behind 10 people at the recent Vermeer exhibition, that the great architects, the Dublin, Cork, London-based architects O'Donnell and Toomey, became fascinated by the folds of the dress sleeves and those spaces created between body and fabric. And that was part of the inspiration that O'Donnell and Toomey took for their design for our new V&A East museum on the East Bank in the Olympic Park. And actually, when you put them together, you can see it so very clearly. Perhaps also why I've been kindly invited here this evening is that the Victoria and Albert Museum too emerged from the legacy of a great international exhibition. Staged in London just 2 years before the Dublin successor, this first World Expo, the great exhibition of the industry of all nations in 1851, was the largest exhibition ever held. In a daring venture of epic scale, 34 nations and their empires displayed more than 100,000 designed products from almost 14,000 exhibitors inside a vast glass building covering almost 19 acres. Each country competed to demonstrate its prowess in design and manufacture. Yet with Britain and its empire dominating the displays, it is so often credited as being a pivotal point in mid-19th century industrialization, that moment of British imperial hubris and Disraeli's great phrase, Britain as the workshop of the world, presenting a view of the world as seen from a primarily British perspective. From this ambitious start, the grand concept of a great international exhibition was born, quickly inspiring other nations to initiate their own versions of its pioneering success. And today, the World Expo tradition continues. And each global gathering of nations, the last in Dubai in 2021, the next in Japan in 2025, welcomes tens of millions of visitors, allowing countries to build extraordinary pavilions and transform host cities, they hope, for years to come. These spectacular gestures hold universal attention and, alongside the modern Olympics, have accumulated the largest gatherings of people of all time. In fact, the scholar Paul Greenhalgh estimates conservatively that between 1851 and 2005, well over 1 billion people visited a World Expo. So from London to Dublin, Dubai to Osaka, how did this mega event for national expression, global connection, and spectacular scale take root? And how should we interrogate its continued relevance today in our own era of decarbonisation and questions around decolonisation? So let's start at the beginning with the tenacious civil servant and the first director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, Sir Henry Cole, looking like a director of the Victoria and Albert Museum should look. He can take much credit for the birth of the Expo. For Cole, the so-called founding father of British international exhibitions, had visited national displays such as the 1849 Exposition Nationale in Paris and had returned to England with a determination to create a truly international adaptation in London. Like many other theories, it came from France, Cole recorded in his autobiography. The early endeavours of the British Society of Art and then the Mechanics' Institute movement had already generated large public exhibitions of art and industry, alongside similar European examples, particularly in France, that set an emphasis on technological advancement, yet they remain distinctly national in scope. The difference came with Prince Albert. With global competition growing, there came an increasing recognition in the potential for market expansion abroad. So when the idea of a great exhibition first originated, the ambitious Henry Cole put it to Prince Albert, as president of the Royal Society of Arts, that the planned spectacle could deviate from that national ideal and embrace foreign productions, in order partly to showcase British industrial lead, but also, crucially, this idea that Albert had, that Britain was falling behind. Albert was a moderniser and a reformer, and just as he modernised the British Army, the Oxford universities, sought to do so at the royal family, he had this very strong sense that the British manufacturing capacity was falling behind its European and global competitors. That by the 1840s and 50s, Britain, which had led the Industrial Revolution in the 1770s and 1780s, was beginning to rest on its laurels. And so a grand exhibition, an international exhibition, would not only be this sort of display of patriotic pride and fervour, it would also be this kind of zeal to transform and update manufacturing and design in the UK. And Albert had this idea of using the exhibition in this much more reformist mode than sometimes we think. This fear over the poor quality of British manufacture, specifically design and workmanship, was part of the original inspiration for the Great Exhibition. So the decision was made to invite the most industrially advanced nations of the world to take part in the, quotes, friendly competition and peaceful goodwill of a decidedly international exhibition, with the idea of Britishness expressed to other nations through the might of industry and empire. And behind it also, this kind of Cobdenite idea of the beneficial, peaceful merits of global free trade. As the Illustrated Magazine of Art would declare in 1853, 400 years ago, the public will and spirit was expressed in tournaments and crusades. Today, the same chivalric sentiment shows itself in exhibitions of international industry. This wasn't quite right, because only a decade earlier, the Eglinton tournament had taken place, which was a lavish medieval display of faux chivalry overseen by Lord Eglinton at his Ayrshire estate, drawing tens of thousands for a chivalric reenactment. And this was always one of, the great tensions of Victorian society. On this one hand, this great historicism and yearning for continuity in the past, and on the other, this thirst for modernity and innovation. And you see that even within the pavilions of the Great Exhibition, where one of the most popular is the medieval court of Pugin. So marrying this historicism and modernity was always a tension within Victorian civic culture. The Great Exhibition was not without public remonstration, despite the enthusiastic support of Prince Albert as president of the Royal Commission, established to oversee the great exhibition enterprise, here having a serious meeting, there was vociferous opposition in some political quarters, mainly arising from the suspected cost to the taxpayer. The Times in particular wrote of the potential damage to Hyde Park and, as ever with the Times, the threat to property values. But often criticism was levelled at the busybody, energetic, modernising Prince Albert himself, who was mistrusted for his overtly, quote, German notions. Colonel Sibthorpe, the Member of Parliament for Lincoln, shown here in this Punch caricature, was extreme in his critique, calling the exhibition, quotes, one of the greatest humbugs, one of the greatest frauds, one of the greatest absurdities ever known. Regardless, Prince Albert pushed ahead, and actually that sort of sneering critique from the aristocratic landed Anglican classes only fired Albert up more in order to achieve its completion. Henry Cole doggedly pursued widespread private sponsorship amongst thousands of contributors. The government, spearheaded by Liberal Prime Minister Lord John Russell, though largely approving, contributed virtually nothing financially. And Caroline and I are well versed with governments asking us to get support from across the country while contributing nothing financially. Over 300 local committees were formed around the UK to gather the funds and organise local exhibitors. Outside London, the greatest support arose from the industrial centres of Glasgow, Leeds, Manchester and Bradford. An architectural competition was initiated to create a building to house it all. Above all, the Great Exhibition was, as Anthony Hamber has recorded, a phenomenal instance of administration and human effort. The sheer scale of the Great Exhibition was perhaps its most impressive asset. A single vast building enclosing 33 million cubic feet was erected in London's Hyde Park to accommodate 10 miles of displays. This so-called Crystal Palace, said to have been christened by Punch magazine, was of course designed by the chief gardener at Chatsworth House, Sir Joseph Paxton, and has been described as one of the most influential buildings ever erected. Paxton's winning design, and this is the original sketch, was adapted from a pioneering glass conservatory he had produced for the Duke of Devonshire's Chatsworth estate in Derbyshire. It salvaged an unsuccessful public competition, with costs arriving at 28% of the nearest rival. It utilised prefabricated, mass-produced components of glass and iron, constructed in an ingenious modular design, and took just 9 months to build. And when we ever have those moments of sort of 10 months of planning permissions and HS2 and sort of everything, we always look back to the building, I think, of the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park as that mid-Victorian notion of can-do achievement. This technologically advanced structure became an awesome indication of the capabilities of industry, and in many ways became the symbol of the age. For this innovative structure enclosed a space so vast that several of the world's largest existing buildings could fit inside side by side. Yet it had to cost proportionally less than the cheapest building imaginable. It needed to be erected in months, not years, and easily dismantled, crucially, at the exhibition's conclusion. Planning disputes, led by the ferocious Colonel Sibthorpe, even forced the building to enclose a series of mature elm trees without causing harm, and the dispute over the trees was another way to bash Prince Albert. As well as the tenacious Sibthorpe, there were also critics on the cultural left. The influential writer and art critic John Ruskin, whose work The Stones of Venice would be issued at the same time, was, as you might expect, sceptical of the capitalist ethos which underpinned its creation. He protested, in that very Ruskinian way, against the notion that the construction of a greenhouse, larger than ever greenhouse was built before, had any artistic significance. It was Ruskin's belief that, quotes, mechanical ingenuity is not the essence either of painting or architecture, and largeness of dimension does not necessarily involve nobleness of design. Just as Ruskin is celebrating the Doge's Palace as the central building of the world, the kind of horror of the Crystal Palace is there presented before him. What was more, the great horror for Ruskin was that the self-congratulation of the exhibition took place while some of the greatest art of European civilization, most notably the cycle of Tintoretto paintings in Venice's School of San Rocco, was at risk of destruction from war and neglect and the shelling of the Austrian army. When all that glittering roof was built in order to exhibit the paltry art of our fashionable luxury, the carved bedsteads of Vienna and glued toys of Switzerland and gay jewellery of France, that very year, I say, the greatest pictures of the Venetian masters were rotting at Venice in the rain for want of roof to cover them, with holes made by cannon shot on their canvas. Ralph Nicholson Warnan, a future keeper of London's National Gallery, was similarly dismissive of the whole enterprise. Quotes, "The paramount impression conveyed to the critical mind must be a general want of education in taste." William Morris and his family also visited the famed exhibition, and though yet not a designer nor a craftsman, the precious 17-year-old William Morris refused to go inside. He condemned the, quotes, "wonderfully ugly British objects on display," and rejected the modern building encasing them. The exhibition would come to embody the sort of exploitative Victorian materialism that Morris fought against throughout his lifetime. Yet for millions of visitors, the Crystal Palace outshone every object brought to reside under its transparent skin. Inside, Paxton's iron columns were decorated in bold primary colours, vivid reds, yellows and blues. This simple paint scheme introduced to the wider public the colour theories of Owen Jones, one of the most prolific designers and important in 19th century Britain. His colourful geometric pattern designs looked to Islamic and Indian traditions for inspiration. It was his strongly held belief that non-Western ornament offered a far superior model for European design to emulate. And his drawings of the Alhambra Palace are shown here on the right. And again, this is one of the interesting sort of tensions, it seems to me, of the Great Exhibition. On the one hand, this announcement of European and colonial industrial might and pride. On the other hand, what emerges from the Great Exhibition is this realization of the profound beauty of South Asian and Persian art and design, which is going to influence so much design thinking in Britain, led by Owen Jones and William Morris in the later 19th century. As the exhibition's superintendent of works, Jones applied his scientific approach to ornament and colour in carefully prescribed proportions to create depth and perspective inside the Crystal Palace. His was also the overall scheme for the entire arrangement of displays. But his colourful designs proved radical to a Victorian public, and these generated much criticism. Jones was undeterred, and his confidence was ultimately vindicated when all criticism dispersed at the exhibition's opening. One visitor even claimed that the building was not decorated with colour, but built up of it. By now a household name, Jones, spurred on by what he saw in the Great Exhibition Crystal Palace, committed to reform contemporary design through arts education, not just for designers, but also for the general public. The eclectic mix of exhibits was extraordinary and wholly undiscriminating. From raw materials to precious metalwork, sculpture to stained glass windows, printing presses to steam locomotives, furniture to domestic conveniences, microscopes to an early submarine, a travelling piano to a prototype fax machine. This collision of consumerism, industry and spectacle was led by the United Kingdom and its empire, which claimed half the floor area. The other half was divided between participating countries and their colonies. Displays introduced Britons to an often otherwise remote idea of empire. As Geoffrey Auerbach has explained, this system, quotes, enabled Britons to locate themselves in the context of their empire and of the broader world, even as it also attempted to incorporate much of the rest of the world into a British-centred economic orbit. It was, I think, a really important moment in giving a global sensibility and an imperial sensibility to so many of the visitors. But Auerbach continues, if Britain used the exhibition to represent the world, so too did its colonies and other countries use the exhibition to represent themselves. The largest number of foreign exhibits came from Britain's close ally and rival, France, and also the United States. The Greek Slave, by American sculptor Hiram Powers, attracted enormous publicity, even becoming one of the most popular and replicated works of the 19th century. People sit before it as rapt and almost as silent as devotees at a religious ceremony, wrote the New York Daily Tribune. It gained acclaim as one of the widely admired exhibits in the classical style of ancient Greece. But it was not produced by Greece, nor located in the small Greek display of natural produce and folk crafts that aimed to portray Greece as a modern European state newly independent from the Ottoman Empire. The dominant image of Greece was instead found within the American court, while the Greek display was located next to Turkey, its former colonizer. The sculpture's notoriety was enhanced further by its relationship to the American slavery debate. We have the Greek captive in dead stone, published Punch magazine. Why not the Virginian slave in living ebony? As Peter Hoffenberg has pointed out, nations and races, resemblance and differences were invented, coordinated and legitimized through the exhibition's carefully choreographed worldview. Comparatively, the exhibition's Irish contributions were few in number. Yet despite the exhibition's proximity to the very worst years of the Great Famine, the committees of the leading cities, Dublin, Cork, Belfast, had still successfully persuaded nearly 300 individuals and firms to send contributions. Members of the Royal Dublin Society were very likely involved in the organisation of these exhibits. While there were Irish exhibits, there was no independent Irish display. Contributions were included within the overarching British section, indicative of that remaining ambiguity over Ireland's relationship with the United Kingdom. The most significant Irish exhibits were in the fields of flax, linen, lace, muslin and poplin. And one of the most notable was the linen display of the Belfast-based Royal Society for Improving and Promoting the Growth of Flax in Ireland, a collection considered so valuable that it was awarded a much coveted council medal. During the exhibition opening, Queen Victoria was even said to be dressed in a robe of Irish poplin. As the official catalogue stated, the exhibition is open to tell its own tale and is now submitted to the judgment of the world. And here this wonderful etching of all the world coming to see the great exhibition. Capitalising on the recent connectivity of the railway across the country, more than 6 million visits were paid to the Crystal Palace, equivalent of 1/5 of the British population when accounting for foreign and repeat visits. More than 100,000 people visited every day at its height. It was, as many have determined since, also the first serious influx to London on a mass scale by international tourists captured here. Such was the exhibition's success that it confounded all predictions and generated a vast profit of £186,000, equivalent to tens of millions today. And you get those wonderful accounts. Amongst my favourite is Titus Salt taking all his workers from Saltaire, from Bradford, on a specially commissioned train down to the Great Exhibition for the day so that the workers could see what was being made around the world and across Britain, and then all having this fantastic lunch and then being taken back up on the trains to Yorkshire. Unsurprisingly, others were keen to replicate this immense publicity, tourism and financial success that could advance what was regarded as a new era of industrial progress. Soon, Ireland's first national industrial exhibition, held in Cork in 1852, was among those hoping to generate significant economic waves of its own. This was, of course, particularly significant for a post-famine economy in a year when emigration was at its peak. Comparatively, Cork's exhibition was small, about 140,000 visitors, but it was successful enough to cover its costs and to provide commercial benefit for its contributors. Star exhibits even included works such as Cork native Daniel Maclise's study for the Spirit of Justice. One report in the Times described the city on the eve of its opening as like a beehive, full of life, expectation, energy, bustle, business. Human industry is awake and active. There's not a tradesman in the city of Cork unemployed. Cork's experiment was, of course, a precursor to a much greater spectacle 1 year later. William Dargan, the leading Irish engineer and railway entrepreneur, believed a larger Irish exhibition, this time international in scope, could be even more beneficial. Dargan proposed to underwrite the cost of transforming the next in the triennial series of exhibitions staged by the Royal Dublin Society. With Dargan's patronage, the 1853 RDS exhibition was to be an Irish Great Industrial Exhibition, the first international exhibition to be held after 1851 and the true successor to Paxton's Crystal Palace. As in London, there was no government assistance. So thanks to Dargan's huge investment of nearly £100,000 and no public subscription, the Irish Great Industrial Exhibition opened on Leinster Lawn on the 12th May 1853. A great hope and promise for the future of Ireland, wrote one contemporary account. And so valued was Dargan's altruistic role that his towering statue was erected inside the building in tribute to his great and inestimable qualities, not only as a public employer, but as the benefactor of his country, as the pedestal inscription read. Of course, another statue honouring Dargan, unveiled at the gallery's opening in 1864, still stands guard outside the gallery's entrance. Dublin's own Temple of Industry was modelled on Paxton's design and also featured a colossal iron and glass pavilion. Yet in this adapted construction by the Irish architect Sir John Benson, knighted for his contribution, the most prominent material was wood. 3 primary exhibition areas were constructed, covering an area of around 6 acres, approximately 1/3 of the area of the Great Exhibition, enclosed by great domed, partially glazed roofs. The scale of the central hall, the organisers were keen to point out, was greater than those of the main hall at the Crystal Palace. And while the interior was decorated in much the same style as Owen Jones's scheme in London, additional features were added to bring about an originality of concept that distinguished it from its predecessor. Just as in 1851, it was deemed that the building itself was perhaps the most successful novelty exhibited, both in art and manufacture. Naturally, Irish art, manufacture and industry dominated over 1,460 exhibitors from the United Kingdom and some 400 from other parts of the world, most notably France, Belgium, Holland, and the German Zollverein coalition of states. All exhibits were arranged according to the 1851 classifications. However, one distinct difference emerged. In London, the fine arts had only been included to demonstrate an element of scientific, technological, or industrial advance. That very strong idea that this exhibition was there to promote technology and design and manufacturing rather than simply the enjoyment of fine or decorative art. There were no official areas in London devoted to painting, few architectural exhibits, while sculpture was used primarily as a decorative device to frame vistas. Dublin recognised this shortfall and attempted to correct the imbalance, declaring that while the industrial or utilitarian arts still dominated, as in London, the fine arts have been admitted to a place in the exposition, and that to an extent not heretofore conceded to them. So Dublin became the first world exhibition to include paintings. Within this expanded fine arts court, over 300 prominent Irish artists were displayed. Francis Danby's The Deluge, William Mulready's The Wolf and the Lamb, Joseph Haverty's Blind Piper, otherwise celebrated works exhibited from the likes of Reynolds, Rembrandt and Rubens. The first sensation experienced by the visitor upon entering the Great Hall of the Industrial Exhibition is that of wonder and admiration, wrote the 1853 edition of the Exhibition Expositor and Advertiser. For the moment, everything crowds alike upon the eye and upon the mind. One of the most spectacular and popular displays was the so-called Eastern collection, comprising mainly Indian and Chinese articles, from clothes, textiles, precious stones and metals, to pieces of armour and weapons. And in fact, this was the same collection of East India Company exhibits, with some supplementary works, as was previously displayed at the Great Exhibition. It proved to be the largest event of its kind ever held in Ireland, attracting over 1 million visitors, including Victoria, who visited with Prince Albert on the 29th of August. She had already sent a large collection of loaned objects to the exhibition, and she later expressed her admiration for the building and its displays. A grand equestrian statue of Queen Victoria by Carlo Marochetti, another medieval throwback in the cultural motif of Eglinton, stood prominently at the building's centre. The statue was later relocated to its permanent home in Glasgow's George Square, and it's not the one that always has the car parking a cone on top of its head. The main exhibition catalogue stated boldly, "We do not doubt that His Royal Highness Prince Albert, on visiting the Irish capital, will earnestly rejoice that his indefatigable exertions and enlightened policy, which made that year 1851 memorable, have again borne rich fruitage and again advanced the best interests of his country." The sense of Dublin's success was replicated in the wider press. "A new Crystal Palace," wrote the Illustrated London News, "has been designed, built, opened and filled with a rich and varied display of objects of art and industry, such as were never gathered together in any part of the world except at the first Crystal Palace in Hyde Park." While rich and varied in many respects, London, and to a lesser extent Dublin, had incorporated the fine arts only as a postscript to objects of industry. 5 years on, Manchester, in a sense, took on the mantle from Dublin and sought to rectify this omission. Despite, and in fact because of, Manchester's industrial dominance, Cottonopolis, the city's 1857 Art Treasures exhibition was to promote fine art above all else. It became the largest of its kind Europe had ever witnessed, with Michelangelo and Raphael competing with Van Dyck, Constables and Titians. And in a sense, that was the purpose. Famously, I think it was the Duke of Manchester, the Duke of Devonshire, when he was asked to lend to the exhibition, he wrote back, "What in the world do you want with art? Why can't you stick to your cotton spinning?" And indeed, that was the very point, that Manchester was seeking to rebrand its identity through its own Art Treasures exhibition, to move away from that kind of Dickensian idea of what the city stood for. Today, the Victoria and Albert Museum owes a great deal to the material legacy of both 1851 and 1853. Besides Crystal Palace memorabilia, commemorative coins, teaspoons, paperweights, mugs, plates, there also exists a bedrock collection of 244 objects purchased from the Great Exhibition that formed the core of a new museum of manufacture, which was the first name for the V&A. This was at the time facilitated by a generous government grant of £5,000 today, £5,000 then, about £700,000 today, secured by the ever-determined Cole to make sure that there was a legacy of the artefacts from the Great Exhibition. Interestingly, the amount spent on Indian acquisitions and South Asia acquisitions was twice that of British objects, and more than 3/4 of that given for continental items. And unsurprisingly, Owen Jones was strongly making the case that the material coming from South Asia and from the Middle East needed to be acquired for a new museum collection. Many great exhibition works made in Dublin were part of this purchase. This, a card table, part of a large suite of bog yew furniture made by Arthur J. Jones and Son, while 3 textile designs exhibited by Dublin firms R. Atkinson & Co. and W.M. Gogan are amongst samples of textiles made for display in 1851. R. Atkinson & Co.'s brocaded poplin design, the top right, won a prize medal, while the firm even had a jacquard loom in action among the displays. Meanwhile, many V&A collection objects were also brought directly from Dublin's Great Exhibition. These brooches were made by G&S Waterhouse of Dublin, who specialise in adapting antiquarian Celtic jewellery. Queen Victoria, too, bought similar items as souvenirs. Waterhouse was the first commercial owner of the celebrated 8th century Tara brooch that, of course, now resides in the National Museum of Ireland. And as will be well known to you, the Tara brooch and the other enormously significant objects, such as the 12th century Cross of Cong, originated from the Royal Irish Academy Museum, and they were loaned to the Great Industrial Exhibition. James Holdsworth & Co. manufactured the machinery that produced this wonderful embroidery and displayed this piece in 1853 to promote the sale of their machines. The trimming was purchased to showcase this industrial process that would take a skilled embroiderer weeks to produce by hands. And while not purchased directly from Dublin, this wood carving by prominent figure William Gibbs Roger was originally exhibited alongside a larger group in Dublin. So coming out of the exhibitions were an important part of the collections for the museum. The V&A owes even more to the Great Exhibition because the profit, the success, despite what Colonel Sibthorpe thought, of the Great Exhibition allowed Prince Albert to think about a legacy. And so he then decided to purchase south of Kensington Palace in an area that would become known as South Kensington, which was orchards in the neighbourhood was then Brompton. He begins to lay out this cultural quarter, what today we call Albertopolis, which houses the Royal College of Music, the Royal Albert Hall, Imperial College, in time Science Museum, Natural History Museum, and of course originally the South Kensington Museum. And here's the vision for laying it out. The plan was to create an establishment in which, by the application of science and art to industrial pursuits, the industry of all nations may be raised in the scale of human employment. And in a sense, this is really one of the kind of first cultural quarters, but actually it's kind of modelled on Berlin and the early combination of universities and museums there. And the South Kensington Museum was originally a combination of science and art. What Albert wanted it to be was the central storehouse or treasury of science and art for the use of the whole kingdom. So rather than just having, as Ruskin and Morris feared, this kind of ephemeral moment of the Great Exhibition, the South Kensington Museum would provide a long-lasting legacy to inspire the designers and makers and creatives and artists of tomorrow with those collections. And to begin with, of course, it was this combination of science and art. And then in 1899, the Science Museum moved over the road. They left us. And the Victoria and Albert Museum, as it became, focused much more on art and design and later performance. So right from the beginning of the South Kensington Museum, of the V&A, it had this strongly almost didactic, utilitarian focus on using these collections, not just for enjoyment, but to encourage artists and creatives and designers to be the very best makers and designers in the world. Education reform lay at the heart of Albert's vision. As Julius Bryant, our keeper emeritus at the V&A, writes, "For these were not to be traditional museums as galleries for connoisseurs and archives for antiquarians, but rather places for the widest public, where collections on display would prompt instruction and debate." And that's why the V&A always had this very, very strong democratic impulse behind it. Again, they like to, in the early days, contrast themselves slightly with the British Museum and National Gallery, that this was just as those millions of people came to Crystal Palace, so the South Kensington Museum was to be this open, popular, democratic space. So, for example, it had one of the first restaurants and cafes in a museum so that you could have an enjoyable day out. There was gas lighting in the galleries so that working people could visit after a day's work. There were labels next to the objects so you didn't have to buy an expensive gallery guide. All of this with a very strong feel of opening up the collections and the objects, the national collections and the objects to the people. One of the great sort of mentors of Prince Albert, the architect and democratic radical Gottfried Semper, described museums as the true teachers of a free people. And this idea that during the growth of democracy in the 19th century, the citizens of the future needed to be educated to weigh the responsibility of democracy properly. And museums were part of that role. And so making sure they felt as open and accessible and engaging as possible was an important part of that. Within the grand pediment of the Victorian architecture, what was intended to be the museum's street-facing main entrance, the V&A's origins were commemorated. A scene in black and gold mosaic reads the first exhibition of the works of industry of all nations. Queen Victoria, you can see in the middle, hands out laurels to the world's prize winners. And the shape behind her, you can see, is the outline of the Crystal Palace. So they're connecting the origins of the museum absolutely with the Great Exhibition of 1851. And the names of the participating nations are then listed in the border. The Belfast-born military engineer, Captain Francis Falk, a man who Cole described as possessing a fertility of invention which amounted to genius. How we'd all like that to be described ourselves, had been brought on to supervise further additions to the expanding museum. Yet before he was tasked in South Kensington, Falk, as a member of the Science and Art Department in London, had been sent to Dublin to report on the planned construction of the National Gallery. Here, he modified the earlier design to mirror the dimensions of the nearby Natural History Museum, completed in 1857. And he introduced pioneering innovations to enhance the National Gallery's construction, ventilation, and lighting. The Irish Times responded enthusiastically. As Giles Waterfield has since described, the new gallery in its central Dublin site asserted the place of Irish culture as part of a broader historical tradition. And it's always said that the masonry that folks use, that his similarity of design between the Royal Albert Hall and then what became the Henry Cole Wing on Exhibition Road is this kind of bricklayers around the world still come and see it for the excellence of its execution. From the push for free trade in a global economy to the pursuit of self-defined national identities, these great exhibitions of 1851 and 1853 have left legacies of astonishing multiplicity. Joseph Paxton's revolutionary glasshouse, more akin to a railway station than traditional museum, sparked countless imitators and heralded a new era in engineering and architecture. In their displays of commercial domesticity, from household items to pioneering conveniences, the exhibitions had a transformative effect on interior decoration and patterns of consumption among an expanding middle class. There was also remarkable levels of social integration with all classes, from royalty to agricultural workers, brought together under one roof. A newly positive definition of working people emerged, forging virtuous associations between labour and creativity. While exposure to international competition kick-started a whole-scale reform of domestic design standards and training, with the already established system of national design schools, again coming out of the Victoria and Albert Museum, expanding and thriving. So how do we apply these lessons gleaned from the great exhibitions to the running of the Victoria and Albert Museum today? How do we reflect upon this remarkable heritage and legacy and its meaning now? I think the first point remains the most powerful, that the foundation of the V&A had a vision of education at its core, and that was a different calling to many other museums established at the same time. The Royal College of Art was part of the Victoria and Albert Museum. The government schools of design were part. Using this collection to inspire makers and artists and designers was central to the mission. And even today, 40% of visitors to the Victoria and Albert Museum describe themselves as from the creative industries. And when we think of these great figures like Owen Jones and William Morris and Henry Cole within the story of the V&A, it connects to that as well. And to my mind, that's needed now more than ever. Because in Britain today, well, in England today, at the very moment when digital technology and the fourth industrial revolution is rendering immaterial the two cultures chasm of the 20th century. And there's no greater symbol of that than the Science Museum separating off from the Victoria and Albert Museum. Our education system is undermining design education at a phenomenal rate. We're seeing the closure of art colleges and design courses. And over the past 12 years, there's been a 71% drop in the number of young people taking design and technology as a GCSE. We're seeing this absolutely stark collapse just at the moment when our economy and society needs this level of support. You combine that with new processes around the curriculum, which narrows the levels of teaching, and also per pupil funding squeeze, which always hits art and design courses. All of that is hurting the teaching of art and design within England. And so to my mind, the role of the V&A is not just to stand by and watch that, but is to do something about it. So we run a number of courses, a number of programs called Design Lab Nation, about sharing our collections across the country, focusing on Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, supporting the professional development of design and technology teachers. And then also in our museums, making sure we're encouraging innovation and creativity. On the bottom right, you can see a picture of the new Young V&A, which opened in July this year. It was the old Museum of Childhood. Many of you remember the old toy museum in Bethnal Green, which was full of wonderful Victorian glass vitrines full of action men from the 1950s, which parents and grandparents enjoyed visiting and children were left bewildered and confused by. And now we've transformed it into a space for children, focused on design, imagination and play, 0 to 14, using our collections to encourage creativity and to build cultural confidence. And then in the top left, you can see one of those architectural renders we've all enjoyed seeing over the years of our new storehouse facility. We simply do not have these number of pediments or neoclassical sculpture within the collection, but this is going to open up the reserve collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum. That question museum directors always get, where have you hidden all the other stuff? Well, you can now go and see it for yourself. And again, this is about, particularly in East London, encouraging designers and makers and artists to engage with the collection. It's a kind of reinventing that idea of a great storehouse of science and art for the 21st century. Secondly, I think the wonder of London and Dublin was the sheer volume of people attending and the range of people attending, not being ashamed of being the people's galleries and having that focus on the public. As Geoffrey Auerbach has said, the Crystal Palace was indeed a shopping mall and a department store. They had that kind of open arcades feel to visiting the collections, which we'd then see in the development of the great department stores of the mid-19th centuries. Whiteley's, for example, when it was opened in 1863, was described as an immense symposium of the arts and industries of the nation and of the world. And so that idea of welcoming the public in, which is so profoundly important. And central to the ethos of that is the public exhibition programme and the public programme. The V&A have been putting on brilliant exhibitions since 1863, when the first exhibition was the wedding list of the Prince and Princess of Wales. So when anyone ever tells me I'm dumbing down the programme, I say, no. The first exhibition was the wedding list of the Prince and Princess of Wales. And in the bottom left, you can see our sellout Gabrielle Chanel Fashion Manifesto exhibition at the moment. But making sure we're keeping the collections alive and the museum alive through public programmes and exhibitions, I think, again, is a big part of the meaning of the museum. And I think museums in the mid-20th century became much more inward-looking and scholastic. And there was one of my great previous directors famously said, we all breathe a sigh of relief when the public finally leave. Whereas actually we're now going back to that mid-Victorian idea of the people's galleries and being open to the public in an accessible and democratic way. And finally, and most importantly, creativity. The Expo movement, sparked in 1851, continues to flourish. Those themes initiated there are still imitated across these global mega events today. Architecture of epic scale, yet temporary in design, global capital and international brands underwriting national boosterism, ambitious content and programming of remarkable scope, and phenomenal appeal, attracting millions over many months. But in our age of net zero ambitions and millennial skepticism about the European industrial colonial past, and with Riyadh now favourite to host World Expo 2030, can we remain confident that the Expo ideal remains relevant and purposeful today? Has this 19th century culture of expansionism, incalculable expenditure, architectural extravagance and mass tourism reached its peak in the coming era of decarbonisation and decolonisation? I think before we dispatch it totally to the scrap heap, we should not lose sight at its core of the importance of the foregrounding in these exhibitions of the maker and the designer. In 1851, it was Joseph Paxton's architectural brilliance and Owen Jones's bold interior schemes that secured the exhibition's legacy. At Expo 2010 on the left in Shanghai, Thomas Heatherwick's wonderfully memorable Seed Cathedral design drew in crowds, won plaudits and prizes. And at Expo 2021, as it became in Dubai, it was Es Devlin's towering timber pavilion with reeling computer-generated poetry that captured imaginations. Powerful creativity and design imprint far greater influence than any nation branding exercise. At the V&A, we continue to place this premium on creativity. We provide, we hope, a place for creative endeavour from Baroque sculpture to digital installation, medieval tapestries to contemporary photography. Just as the visiting public were inspired by what they saw inside the Crystal Palace, the V&A's galleries, like the National Gallery of Ireland's, exist to inspire for every new generation. So let us finally just remind ourselves of who it was all for and why. In 1857, Benjamin Barker, this wonderful autodidact, this meticulous autodidact from Leeds, a woolen manufacturer from Leeds, journeyed to Manchester by rail, you could do that in those days, to witness firsthand what an international exhibition could offer. And he writes in his diary, rose at 6:30, went to Leeds by 7:14 train, started to Manchester by a special train at 8:35 by Huddersfield, got to Art Treasure's exhibition at 12:40, got lunch outside, open brackets, took it in my pocket, went in at 1, inspected Museum of Ornamental Art until 2 o'clock, 2 till 3 in Watercolour Gallery, 3 till 4 photographs, 4 to 5 ancient and modern masters. At 5:05, went out to the train, got in, started for home at 5:25, got to Leeds at 9:40 and could not get to Bramley until the 11 o'clock train. When most museums today would be hard-pressed to equal the kind of outreach project that London, Dublin and Manchester married, there remains, to my mind, much to learn from these spectacular jesters, these great exhibitions of 1851 and 1853. Thank you.